Hello, everyone. Good evening. And now we have one more talk for Poliglotar 2021. And it's going to be given by Ricardo Gualda about accelerated language learning through self-immersion. Okay, Ricardo, please, you have the floor.
Okay, so thank you, Juliano. Thank you, Robson. I'm very happy to be here tonight, and it's a great honor to share some of what my work has been, my research has been in language learning and gifted language learning and immersion settings. And great to be with the other language nerds around. I've always looked for you guys, and now finally found you. It's been a lonely time in the last 30 years, but now with the internet, things are getting better. So let me just share my screen here. Oh, all right. See if I'm doing this right. Oh, this is wrong. Just 1 second. This always happens when I'm.
I think you are in the last slide,
F5.
right?
Yeah. Oh, no. Do you see the? Okay, so you can see the good,
yes.
the big thing. So the topic of this talk is the research that I'm a professor and I'm a researcher and associated professor at the Universidade Federal da Bahia. And I've been working on Portuguese as a foreign language and different languages as well. And I'm very interested in the topic of gifted language learners. That's what it's called. It's learners that are very good at learning languages, and especially in immersion settings, because I've been working on that practically as a coordinator for different language courses in the university in different countries for the last 20 years. So this is what I'm most interested in, and how to do immersion right. And especially now with the internet, how to do self-immersion. So how do you yourself put yourself into immersion even without being in the country where the language is spoken. I've been working on that for the last few years, as I said, and now I've been working very intensively on, after the beginning of the pandemic, I started working on self-immersion. So it's how you put yourself into immersion in a bubble, even without leaving your house. So that's what we're going to be talking about. So first of all, talking about linguistic immersion, the internet has drastically changed the, is my video off? Okay. So the internet has scrambled the whole concept of immersion, because up until 2000, the idea was you'll do a little bit of language learning on your own. You take a language course. Mostly before the internet, it was, you would enroll in the language course, and then you would, at some point, when you reached the pre-intermediate level to the advanced level, at some point you would go to the country where the language is spoken, and that would theoretically accelerate your learning. It's not always like that, but that was the intention of it. So for now, I'm going to be talking about geographic immersion, which is when you go to the place where the language is spoken. Self-immersion, when you do it yourself at home, in a remote location, so not at the place where the language is learned. But also there's an added difficulty with the internet, which is, it used to be in 1996 when I lived in Germany that you went to the place where the language is spoken and you were really insulated from your own original linguistic community. But now what we have been seeing in the last 15 years is that students come to Brazil, where they go to do a geographic immersion. And then the internet also allows them to enclose themselves into a bubble. So they're physically in the place where the language is spoken, but they're not in linguistic immersion. They're still, most of their social activities happen with speakers of the same language, be it inside or remotely through the internet. So now geography helps a lot, but it's no guarantee that you're going to have a linguistic immersion or that you're not going to be able to have a linguistic immersion. So the internet has scrambled everything. So this is what's interesting that's happening now. Now, as I said, immersion is not a panacea. So there's been a lot of research since the late 1980s on language immersion. And what we see is that about 30% of university students that go for an Erasmus or a semester abroad or something like that do not engage in linguistic immersion. So they live in a bubble in the country and they don't get much out of it. And then it's a continuum. So between 30 and 50% of the students, 20% of the students between the 30th and the 50th percentile have limited linguistic exposure and learning. And then it's about 50% of the students, especially if they have guided activities, they have somebody helping them with the process, that they achieve linguistic immersion. And this has to do with the difficulty that different people have in engaging in intercultural strategies, emotions. So some people feel homesick, they feel sad, they feel depressed. This is very, very common. And also adherence to the target cultural community. So you go to a different country and you don't really want to become part of that cultural community. It's part of most of the time it's an unconscious choice, but you're enjoying your experience. You're good at developing intercultural strategies, but you just don't feel like part of that, linguistic community. That's very, very, very common. So what happens is that this idea that you can only learn a language if you go to the country where that language is spoken, or that as soon as you go to the country where the language is spoken, you'll start learning. That's just not true. Sorry, I was trying to open the chat here. I can't, but I'll continue anyway. And also, there's a combined but associated thing, which is one thing is to be able to deal with the cultural challenge of geographic immersion. The other thing is to learn language out of it, because people have different have great variations in language learning ability, in language learning outcomes. So for example, age is very important. So we know that the younger you are, usually the better you do. Aptitude. So there are two kinds of aptitude. Some people are very good at noticing things. So they hear things and they listen, they're able to notice grammatical phenomena happening, or a phonetic phenomena and stuff like that. So they don't need a lot of classes. They can notice most things by themselves. And also the aptitude, it's the ability that people have to develop their own learning strategies. That's very, very important. So people who can develop their own their own learning strategies by themselves, they create their own method, they do very, very well. And people who are able to notice linguistic phenomena, they do very, very well on themselves, regardless of whether they're taking a course, they're in immersion, or they're doing it on their self learners and so on. Personality is very important. Usually outgoing people do better than shy people. Introverts do worse in general than extroverts. So I'm going to show you in the end, I'm doing a workshop on accelerated language learning. It's been going on for 6 months, and we're next week is going to be our last session. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but usually introverts love learning by themselves, and they have more difficulty dealing with other people and in spontaneous interactions, especially. So it's a bonus. Usually outgoing people, extroverts do better. And emotions, if you're anxious, if you're traumatized by the language learning process and so on, you do worse than others. So there are different things there are other factors as well, but these are very, very important. Oh, it's not moving. What do I do? Okay, so these are the limitations. So what is immersion good for? Well, it's good for many things, but one of the most important things is that you learn fast, and you learn deeper, you learn better, and you learn faster. It takes a lot of energy out of you, but it's very effective. So what does it do? So what is immersion? So immersion is when you have intensive exposure. So you have it very intensive. So you have a problem on your cell phone, and your cell phone talks to you in the target language. Your cell phone, all of the everything on your cell phone is in Russian, for example. So you have to solve a problem. And so you're worried, you got all those things to deal with. And or for example, you have a romantic partner, so a boyfriend, a girlfriend who's in that language, and you have an argument. So that's very intense. Also, extensive exposure. That means all different kinds of exposure. So it means that when you go to the supermarket, you do it in the target language. When you have a fight with your boyfriend, you have it in the target language. When you go to the when you go to work, you do it. So it's different kinds. It's reading, it's writing, it's speaking. It's all of them combined. High register, low register, all different kinds of situations. One very important thing of immersion is surprise. Because when you're learning by yourself, you control your input, your linguistic input. But when you're in immersion, suddenly something happens that you never expected, and you learn things that you wouldn't otherwise. You wouldn't have selected that. Recontextualization is very important. So you learn a word in a class, or you learn a grammar feature in a class, or whatever linguistic phenomenon it is. And then you see it over and over and over in different contexts. And that's very important for automatization, to gain fluency. So you can't just take a list of vocab and memorize it, because this is very common among students. When you're about to use that, you don't remember it, or it takes a lot of effort to remember it. So language learning has a lot to do with automaticity. So in order to gain that, you need a lot of reinforcement, and immersion gives you that. And the most important thing is dominance. Dominance means that whenever you spontaneously, you're thinking with yourself, the language that comes first to your mind is the dominant language. And the language that influences the other languages you speak is the dominant language. Usually that's the mother language. But for example, when I go to the United States, English automatically, there's a spatial trigger. There's I see the things around and I recognize things, and it suddenly triggers English dominance. So for me, it's when I speak Portuguese, I start speaking it with an accent, and I start using English in my Portuguese, and I start transferring from English to Portuguese. And the first things that come to my mind are in English, not in Portuguese. Interestingly, this doesn't happen when I go to England or when I go to other English-speaking countries. It only happens when I go to the United States, but it has to do, well, I'd have to explain anchoring and geographic anchoring and so on. But dominance is very important, and it's something you can train for. So right now I'm doing an immersion in French because I have an exam to take at the end of the month. And I've been training myself to have French dominance. But this is something that's happens when you're doing an immersion. So that language becomes your default language, and that's very important. So this is what you get out of immersion. That's why immersion is so effective. That's why you learn so much and so fast and so well. Now, self-immersion. Self-immersion is a little tricky. So it's the process of simulating the full immersion experience and simulating its effects, but from a remote location. It's a little bit challenging, but it works. It happens and it works, and I've tested it on myself and I've tested it in other people as well. So it works, and it's very, very effective for language learning. It's often described in the literature as immersion at home. I don't like that term, so I use self-immersion instead, because you couldn't be somewhere else. It doesn't have to be home. I don't know. But usually if you go to the internet and they talk about immersing yourself at home, they're going to be saying things like, watch movies in the target language, shift your computer and your phone, your smartphone to the target language, start listening to music and to the radio in the target language. That is increasing the quality and the extent of exposure. But that doesn't mean that you're going to get all the effects that I was talking about. That doesn't mean that if you don't do it in a more disciplined way, you're not going to get the most important thing, which is dominance. And you're not going to have, you may not get all the effects that you want. So there is a way of doing self-immersion. So what you want those things that I listed before. Intensive exposure. So you want sometimes to get really deep So it's like when you're listening to a song and you're reading the lyrics and you're trying to understand it, and then you memorize the song. So that's intensive exposure. Extensive exposure, which is all different kinds of experiences. So the supermarket, the one-on-one talk, the podcast, writing emails, working in that language. So different kinds of exposure, linguistics exposure. Surprise, which is you get things that you normally wouldn't listen to, you wouldn't get. That's very, very important. Different kinds of recontextualization, that's very important. Reinforcement and dominance. Dominance is when that language becomes your default language, which is the most difficult thing to do. So you don't get that very easily. So how do you do self-immersion? That's the tricky part. It's harder than it looks. It's not just switching your cell phone language to, say, German, or watching movies in German every night. There's more to it than it. So first of all, you need a lot of time. If most of your day is in Portuguese, for example, and that's your mother language, it's very difficult to have self-immersion, because if you're going to class or if you're going to work in Portuguese, or if it's difficult to self-immerse because dominance requires a lot of time listening to that language. But more, it requires a lot of will. You really need to want it. You need to want it very much, because it's very uncomfortable. Because most of the time you're going to be making an effort, an artificial effort. It's very tense because you can't listen to the songs that you're used to listening to. You can't watch the shows that you want to watch. You can't, you have to be thinking. When I go to bed and I start dreaming, I condition myself to dream in French. So that's something very difficult to do, and it takes a lot of will. It takes a lot of, it's not physical effort, it's not a lot, it's focus. You have to be thinking about it all the time. So you really, and sometimes it's more difficult than others. Sometimes there are pitfalls. There's times that you just want to relax, So that's why you really need to want it. You really need to commit to it. It's like losing weight or doing physical activity for the first time. It requires a lot of willpower all the time. For that, you need community support. So one thing that I'm trying to do by teaching this workshop is to build an online community of people who are doing the same thing, even if they're doing it at different levels and different languages, so that when they're at a difficult crossroads, they can just count on their colleagues to help them a little bit, because sometimes it's difficult. It's true. It's just how it is, And now, the most important thing to understand is that, so there's many different things that we discuss in the workshop, but multiple studies through the years in different contexts shows that different learners learn in different ways. And this is the first problem that we face with these language learning courses. Because what happens usually with language learner courses is that it's a one-size-fits-all approach. There's one book, there's one class, there's one teacher, and they all do the same thing. So that's one problem. Usually when you let students learn by themselves, on their own, they develop radically different learning strategies. And that's very important. So you have to develop your own learning strategies. And so you have to learn how to do that. So that's one thing that we talk about in the workshop. And so that's the first thing. You have to develop your own activities, your own learning style, your own learning strategies, and they have to be varied. So first of all, they have to be fun. I tell students, your learning hours, your learning moments should be the best of the day. You should be anxious to get to that. If it feels like work, you're doing something wrong. It should not feel like work. It should be like the most fun you have during the day. So I can't see the chat for some reason. So if you're saying something really important in the chat, I'm going to get to questions after I finish this. So I'm going to leave some time for that. So I hope that, sorry for that, but I can't really see the chat from here. So as I was saying, it has to be fun. It has to be the best time of your day. Second, it has to be productive. You have to see results. And you have to also understand how language learning works. So the courses and formal courses, they usually teach you that it goes on a straight line uniformly and it progresses slowly. That's not how it works. When you look at learners learning languages, what happens is that there are peaks and there are valleys. There are moments when you're incredibly productive and that you learn so much in so little time and so well. And there are moments when you reach a valley and things just don't move. And you have to understand that process, because when you get into a valley, and that happens often, it happens very, very often. You can't just think, oh, I can't learn anymore. That's usually what happens. I've reached my peak. I plateaued. So I'm going to move on and do something else. Exactly, the plateau. So the plateau doesn't exist. It's just the cycle of learning. It goes up and down. It goes up and down all the time. So if you're expecting regularity and you hit a valley, what happens is that you think you're failing. So you've got to understand how the process works, so that whenever you have these typical moments in which it stops, it doesn't work as much, that you know what to do. That's very important, instead of despairing and giving up. Because of course, language learning is very dynamic. It changes all the time, and it takes a long time. It takes very, very long. So you have to understand the process in order not to get frustrated. Also, you have to create a daily activity. So it has to be fun. You have to see results, understand the process. It has to be varied. You can't just do one thing. You have to do different things so that you get surprise, you get variety, you get recontextualizations, and you get reinforcement. So it has to be varied. It has to be very intense. So it's not just listening to radio and TV and videos all day long, because if you don't have moments of intensity, you don't push your knowledge forward. So you have to have both. And you have to manage it well. I'm going to show you how in a moment. It's that you can't just have moments in which you study really intensely and then, so this is a problem with language courses, that usually you take classes twice a week or 3 times a week for 2 hours. Well, that's not how your brain works. Your brain works for language learning, usually, especially when you're talking about memory, you transfer part of short-term memory into long-term memory in cycles of 24 to 48 hours. So you need to do a lot of reinforcement within 24 hours so that you retain that knowledge. So if you have classes twice a week, you're probably going to have a class. You're going to have 2 hours of excessively intense learning. So it's too much content. There's not going to be enough reinforcement. You're going to forget most of it. And then when you get to the next class, you start over again. So that's a very poorly managed way of learning languages. And you have to be very proactive. You are the learner. Don't depend on a teacher, on a course, or a book, because that never works. Well, it does sometimes, but only for very gifted language learners. Wait, it's going to move now. So what do we, so this is the beginning of the workshop. I'm not going to tell you everything that we discuss in the workshop. But usually what you got to start doing is developing a daily routine. Usually what happens is that when students get it, when they get to the right point, to the most productive cycle of learning, you do the very same things every day the same way. So this, I call it the 3 stages of language learner. Developing language learning strategies. And this would be, I don't have time to get into that, but you have to develop your own methodology, and often you have to change that, and you have to make it as varied as you can. So you need to do learning new stuff, remembering that stuff, and that having that stuff recontextualized. This is how you do it. So you have to select high intensity activities. So usually I do 1 or 2 high intensity activities a day. I do 1 or 2. Most people do 1, 2, 3 at the most. But some people, if you really like, if you take a couple months to do some high intensity activities, you can do up to 6 if you're just doing that, if you're fully immersed. And these can go in blocks. So I usually do 1 to 2 blocks, 15 to 2 hours. It depends how, on your own pace, your own rhythm. This varies very much from person to person. But this is focusing very intensely on one thing. It can be a song, it can be a textbook, it can be a video, it can be talking one-on-one with another speaker, it can be whatever. You pick and choose. Some people do translation. That's the thing. You have to figure out what it is that works for you. And it's very important that you learn how to select things and how to work on these things. And I don't have a lot of time to get into that, but if in the workshop, we do lots of sessions on that. Then you have to schedule medium intensity activities. So what you do is that, for example, you've listened to a song, you've learned all of the lyrics, all of the new words and the pronunciation and the grammar, everything that's involved in the song, and you started memorizing it. So the important thing for you to retain that knowledge is to do little tasks. So say you've learned the chorus, o refrão, the chorus of that song. So every 2 hours or every 1 hour, every 3 hours, you set your alarm clock and you memorize that again. You say that out loud again, or you sing that out loud again. These are recall activities. So if you're reading a text, it's just going over the words or expressions that you've selected. Or if you're practicing pronunciation, you have to do this many times a day. I usually do it every hour, or depending on your daily activities, you can do, you space it out according to work or personal, obligations and things like that. The most important thing, though, is that right before you go to sleep, when you're lying down on your bed and you're just falling asleep, you go over everything that you've learned that day. That's incredibly powerful, because it's exactly when you're asleep that things go from short-term memory to long-term memory. So if you condition yourself to think about the things that you've learned, a very quick review sheet, right before you fall asleep, the probability of you retaining that is much, much higher. And the probability that you dream in that language about that situation. So there are ways to condition yourself. So usually if I've watched a show, I did for a long time self-immersion in Russian. Now I'm doing it in French, as I mentioned. So what I do is that I watch TV in French right before I go to bed. And then I imagine I think of all the things that I've learned that day, and then I imagine myself having a conversation with one of the characters of the show. And then as I fall asleep, I start dreaming about that in French, because with that person, I'm only going to speak in French, even though it's a fictitious character. And the moment you wake up, you go over your content sheet again. That's very powerful to retain the knowledge. Now, it's also very important that you schedule a lot of low intensity activities throughout the day. So passively listening to music, watching TV, or talking to people, or doing readings and things like that, because what happens is that that recontextualizes. So you learn a word, and then you see it in a different context, and that reinforces your learning very much and automatizes what you're learning. So you gain a lot of fluency, and reading and napping, a lot of people do that. So, and also low intensity activities may replace the just before bed and just as you wake up. So what I do is that I watch a French show right before I go to bed, and I listen to French news right as I wake up. And that's incredibly powerful for setting you up for a dominance. So, which is always thinking in French before thinking in Portuguese. So now, as I mentioned to you, I did a workshop. I'm so happy about it. It's Wednesday evenings. Next Wednesday is the last one. And Wednesday evenings are the happiest time of the week for me. It's so much fun. I started, so 44 people enrolled, but only 29 showed up in the first day of the workshop. 12 showed up in the second, and now 6 are finishing. So there was a big dropout rate. That was a little bit disappointing to me. But I think that happened was that I only offered it to students in language and linguistics at UFBA. So these were students, and it was for non-Romance languages, just because the way you learn closed languages and distant languages is very different, and I didn't want to mix the two. So, and I was hoping that I would get more language nerds learning nerdy languages, and I did get a bunch of them. So I get one who's learning modern Greek, one who's learning Arabic, one who's learning Norwegian, and the other one's learning German, and the other 2 are learning English. But what happened, I think, was that a lot of the students who enrolled for the workshop were students who were traumatized by English, had a lot of trouble learning English, and they thought that I was going to give them some magic pill, a magic formula for learning languages. And it's not like that. It still takes a lot of effort, a lot of determination, and a lot of willpower. And I think that what happened was that this is a kind of self-learning which works very well for very highly motivated learners, but not for more average learners. So, but the 6 are, they're incredible. They're really motivated, and it's been great. So what we do is that, I'm planning on, so what I'm going to do now is that I'm going to set up a MOOC, which is a massive online, there's one O missing. It's MOOC with Rios. It's a massive open online course, which probably going to be on Coursera. So that's going to take a little bit of setting up, but it's going to be ready so people will be able to access it. I'm starting to write a book, which I'm going to publish next year with the whole contents of the workshop. And I'm going to do different editions of the workshop as well. There might be a fee, but a nominal fee, a very low fee, 50 reais, 100 reais, something like that. So nothing prohibitive. It's just for administrative course costs and things like that. So the thing that we do is first, we discuss the language learning process. So you have to understand that there's a lot of misconceptions about how the language learning process works. And people get frustrated because they don't get the results that they are promised. And then they start giving up. They start feeling that they're failing, and it's not exactly what's happening. It's just that there's lots of myths and a lot of misconceptions about the language learning process. Then I explain to people what self-immersion is and what is self-immersion and what isn't self-immersion. I'll let you know. I'll let Hobson, I'm sure he's going to email all the information to all of you if you're interested. So it's important to understand what is self-immersion, what isn't self-immersion, and how you get there. Then we build immersion routines. So there's a lot of students first don't understand exactly what is a high intensity activity, what's a recall, and so on. So we do a lot of discussion on that. They think that there are things that they're allowed to do. There are things that they're not allowed to do. And I try to explain to them that there's a lot of freedom. Language is in everything. It's in sports, it's in sex, it's in relationships, it's on TV, it's in every facet of life. So just pick the ones that you love the most, and you're absolutely free to do anything you want with it. Then different learning strategies, that's an important thing, so that you have to respect. So students felt at first that they could, one student started doing, he's very religious, so he started learning from the Bible. And he felt guilty because he was learning from the Bible and he had never done that. And I was telling them, the Bible's fine. There's language in there. Use it. If you love the Bible, do it. There's students, another student was watching Tacky TV, and he's like, the shows that I'm watching are so horrible, I can't even mention them because they're so, cheesy and stuff. And I was telling them, do whatever you want. And then how to combine different things so that you have enough variety and you have enough intensity and so on. Then motivation and community, that's very important, because throughout the workshop, we saw people who were doing very well very early, and then people who took a little longer. Then the ones who were doing very well really early, then they started not doing so well. So community helps a lot, to give suggestions, to exchange ideas, and especially to exchange motivation and support. That's very, very important. Even I'm super nerdy when it comes to languages. This has been the story of my life, learning languages and all. But sometimes I too lose motivation. So community is very, very important to keep it going. So bravo to what you guys are doing. It's fantastic. Then explain how language learning works in terms of primary linguistic scenes, secondary linguistic scenes. This is a whole talk. I can't get into that right now. Interculturality. So how do you deal? So this is more tricky than people think, because, okay, so you're going to fill your day with TV and music and all of that from that language, but then suddenly you realize that you don't really love the music in that culture. You don't really love I've had that problem with French. The music is, the TV, oh my God. So it's really hard to get into. It's really hard to get into that. You have to break some barriers in order. Russian was the same thing. Finding music that I tolerated was very difficult. Finding TV shows that I could watch was very difficult. So interculturality, I'm stuck now, is very important. And then dominance. How do you train your brain to have that language become your dominant language at that moment when you're not geographically? Yeah, the movies are better. TV is, but now with Netflix and the series, yeah, French art is great. I just watched Mito, which is fantastic. I've watched Family Business, which is great. So there are different things. There's enough. Every culture is there's a lot of, especially in these big languages. There's a lot of cultural production. You just have to find them. So for example, for the students in the workshop that are doing modern Greek and Norwegian, it's more difficult because there's a lot of English there. And there isn't as much cultural production, artistic production in those languages. But then I told them, go to the countryside, go to the little towns and go to community radio and things like that. And you'll find more interesting things and more things in the language. And then they did, and they were very happy about that. So that's why the workshop and the community are very important, because, when people get stuck, other colleagues, have lots of ideas. So for the Arabic speaker, he was saying, I'm watching Egyptian TV, but it's awful. It's horrible. So then the guy who was doing Greek said, oh, but, have you ever tried Israeli TV in Arabic Israeli TV? And then he said, no. So he started doing that. And then he was like, wow, this is fantastic. It's really good. So the community is it's very important, because sometimes you just get stuck. You don't have new ideas. You just need the support of other people. So that's why I'm working really hard on building a self-immersion community on Instagram. But again, everything's a little bit difficult. Instagram to me is, I don't know how to use it very well. So we're all trying new things. We're all trying to do that. So you need to understand the process, its pitfalls, its rewards, and focus on the rewards and recognizing the pitfalls and learning how to react when you hit a pitfall, when you hit a brick wall. You need a lot of focus. You need to have that mindset that you're thinking about learning that language all the time. That's the most difficult part. It's not the time, it's not the energy, it's not developing the learning strategies, it's keeping focused for a long period of time. That's very difficult. That's the biggest challenge, I think. You need to develop your own learning strategies and routines, and you need to change them as circumstances change. So so the Arabic learner was telling me last week that he's done with the alphabet. He's learned the alphabet. He's very good on that now. And he's learned the very basic stuff. Now he's got to start learning how to produce creative sentences, his own basic creative sentences. And he was like, it's so difficult. I don't even know how to start it. So now he needs to develop new learning strategies, and that happens all the time. So as you progress, or another student got a new job, and he said, now my daily routine is all scrambled up again. So the whole time you have to develop new learning strategies and new routines. And so you need to understand that that's how the process works, and not expect something to fall from the sky, like a book, a textbook, or a teacher, or something like that who's going to help you. And you need to be very proactive, come up with new things all the time. So what are the results from the workshop? So first of all, participants, they started enjoying it. They say it's difficult. There were moments that they wanted to give up, but they say, no, I'm really enjoying it. I found things that I really love using to learn language, and I found a learning routine that's really enjoyable. Because sometimes people feel guilty if they're enjoying an intellectual activity like language learning. They feel like it has to feel like work. And it shouldn't feel like work. Work is bad. Work is annoying. Work is horrible. Who likes work? No, it should be fun. It should be your leisure activity. So a lot of people feel guilty about that, about enjoying it, about doing silly things in language. It's a game. It's children's play. That's why they learn. One of the reasons why they learn so well. Also, what they say is, one student told me that last week, this Wednesday, he said, well, I think that, he said, because we're finishing the workshop, so we're starting to evaluate the results, and we have a discussion on the results, on what people are doing every week. So he said, well, I think that now I have the tools in order to keep on learning by myself. And that's the most important thing, is to understand how the process works in depth, and to understand how to do the self-immersion on your own. And then, calmly adjust to the changing circumstances through the years, because it's going to take a lot of years, and through the different stages of it. So that's very important. And the other thing was the one thing that as participants were very excited about, was that they recognized the peaks and valleys. The valleys aren't so fun, but the peaks are fun. The peaks are wonderful. So I did a self-immersion. I think Volia is in the room. I can't see her picture right now. But Volia was my Russian teacher for a while. She's the one who was talking, giving Volia and Patterson. They were giving the talk just before this one. And there was this period when I went to spend 3 months in Russia during the holidays, during the student break. And when I came back, she says, Volia. And when I came back, Volia said, oh, как ты говоришь? I remember her face. It was just one moment that I did, very intense self-immersion, and the amount of learning I did in 3 months was just unbelievable. It was really one very long peak of learning. And I was doing, I had another teacher who was teaching me on verbling online. And day after day, he would say, Ricardo, what did you do today? Because you've learned so much. It's just so different. So one thing that students in the workshop have said was, last week I've learned more than I've ever learned in the last few years. I just don't understand. I mean, when you feel that rush, that you're learning so much, so fast. But for that, you need to have all those things that I mentioned before. You need to have dominance. Dominance is very important. You need to manage the different kinds of activity. You need to manage your schedule through the day. You have to fill the gaps with low intensity activities. So if you do all of those things, and you can sustain it for a period of time, usually it's going to be 6 weeks, or it's going to be 2 months, not longer than that. You can have long, a period of 2 months of intense learning is very productive, because you learn so much. It's not like, so see, this is the myth that you're going to learn a little bit every day. It's not like that. There are moments when you learn a lot, and then there's moments when you don't learn much at all. So this is, but it's really exciting. When you feel that rush of an extreme productivity moment, that's fantastic. But you shouldn't give up when that finishes. You just should readjust, so that you build the foundation for another period of intensive learning. So I'm going to conclude now, so that you have time to ask me questions and we can have a little bit of discussion. But the self-immersion is possible, it's and viable, but only for highly motivated language learners, gifted language learners, people with time and with the will to do it, because it's difficult. It takes a lot of effort, just as language learning does. It affects your brain's anatomy, physiology. It changes your mindset, your cultural situation. You start living in the border between different cultures, and it's learning a new language is the most complex cognitive task that your brain can have. when you do MRI scans, MRI is magnetic resonance imaging. There's a lot of studies on that. Language is the only one cognitive process that lights up the whole brain. When you're doing different tasks, you'll light up parts of your brain, parts for vision, parts for smell, parts for thinking, parts for aggressivity, and music, and so on. Language is the one thing that lights up your whole brain. It's incredibly complex, and learning a new language shifts even the anatomy of your brain. You produce more gray cells. It's very complex. So it takes a lot of effort. So there's no going around that. But there's ways to make it more effective, to make it faster, and to learn that language better. So self-immersion is very difficult to achieve, but if you can get there, it produces very accelerated learning. It produces community support, which is great. You have to create strategies to cope with difficulties and thoughts of giving up, which is fantastic, because your number one enemy when you're learning a foreign language is giving up. The moment you give up, you stop learning. So the most important thing is to keep going, regardless of how, with the ups and downs of the whole process. And it may be applied, the fun thing is that it may be applied to different types of learners, different languages, at different levels of learning. So you can do it at a very basic level in Chinese, an advanced level, an intermediate level in Russian, an advanced level in French, which is my situation, basic Chinese, intermediate Russian, and advanced French. And well, we can discuss that. I'm looking at the chat now. I'm just finishing, so we can get to the questions now. Thank you for listening. Friday evening. Hope you have a lot of questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your very interesting and enticing lecture on self-immersion and accelerated language learning. I think it helps us dispel many myths on, for example, like the correlation between studying abroad and language proficiency, right? Which do not always have like a very positive correlation, right? Because I think that your program shows that anyone can learn from wherever they are, especially in times like
I wouldn't
these.
say that. I wouldn't say that. I would say that, first of all, there's extensive literature on the fact that just doing geographic immersion doesn't guarantee linguistic immersion. And that has to do with your ability to develop intercultural strategies. So you can train for that, but there's some people that just because of their personality and mindset, they deal with the stress of a geographic immersion better than others. So I've had students in the Portuguese course here at UFPA that they thrive. They just, they date, they practice sports, they get a class, they do all sorts of different social activities. So they adapt really well to the immersion experience, culturally speaking.
Yeah.
And there are students who it's just too much for them. It's just too much of a stimulus. It's just too intense, and they just close up. And I've had cases of severe depression and people who just had to leave just because it was too much for them. So people have different abilities, different skills in terms of abilities to develop language learning strategy. Intercultural social strategies. Now, another thing, so for some people, geographic immersion is very productive. For other people, it's extremely tense. It's too much. There's an overload, and it's just not for them. And it's a very relevant part of the population.
Exactly. That's what I was trying to say. I mean, sometimes people just think that, by going abroad, by residing abroad, they're going to be,
that's not the case.
They're going to become fluent in a language. But there's a concept called, like at the beginning of the lecture, I thought about like a concept that we have like in study abroad research, which is called like language engagement, because it's all about like how much you engage, right? But
there's two things, Hobson. There's the social intercultural aspect of it, and then there's the linguistic aspect of it. So usually they go together, but in some cases you can get somebody who's very apt in terms of developing social strategies, And sometimes you get people who are very apt in, but they're not very good at learning languages. So they engage really well and they adjust really well to the cultural challenges of immersion, but not so well, they don't learn the language, and vice versa. Sometimes you have, especially introverted people who are very good at learning languages, but they're not so good at interacting culturally. So it varies. Now, you said anybody can learn a foreign language. That's not what studies show. Unfortunately, for adult learners past the critical period, there's about 5 to 10% of the population who are highly gifted language learners. It's GLL, gifted language learners. That means they, after many years of learning and residence in the linguistic community, they learn language to the point that native speakers don't recognize them as foreign speakers. That's about 5 to 10% of the population. But you also get, so I can break down, for example, when I get every year, when we get foreign students coming into the intensive Portuguese program, in the second week, I can tell you who's in the top 10. Those are, I don't even need to teach them anything. They'll learn by themselves. We get people from the 30th to the 90th, 70th to the 90th percentile. With minimal instruction, they're going to do very well linguistically. Then we get people from the 30th to the 70th percentile who need classes and they need projects and they need attention and they need instruction, but they do well. And then we have people in the bottom 30 who just are very challenging.
Yeah,
we need to spend a lot of resources and a lot of things. So
exactly.
aptitude matters.
Yeah, individual differences as well. But when I say that everybody can learn a language, it's because, well, we may be like, you know, we may have like contrasting opinions, but, you know, sometimes like learning a bit is also good for that person, depending on the person's goal as well, right? Because sometimes we expect everybody to be like highly proficient or, you know, to achieve like native like performance, right? So that's actually what I meant.
Yeah, but I understand, but you know, I also want to believe that anybody can do anything, but the problem is that the data, especially more recent data on language learning outcomes, shows that there are people who are in residence, who are who have extensive exposure in the language, who want to improve their linguistic proficiency, and they just can't.
Yeah,
so
they don't learn as much as somebody who's more like apt for
so
language
aptitude is
learning.
real. Aptitude is real. And the problem when, as a coordinator of intensive language courses, what I try to do is that I try to teach people with different abilities in different ways. So usually what I do is that with the very apt students, I give them minimal instruction and I let them do their own thing. With students at the in the intermediate range of language learning abilities, I do more conventional 5 times a week and so on. And for the students in the bottom, I usually do a lot, you know, of individual attention, social goals, lots of extra instruction. So you have this idea that you're going to teach a language using the same methods for everybody, the same routine, the same learning strategies, and the same time on task, that's you're not going to get a lot of good results.
I see. Okay, so let's try to, you know, have some more people here, you know, ask questions. So Selene, seems like she's like the first one. Selene, oh, you just raised your hand.
Oh yeah, may I? Sure. Well, let me ask first, where are you from originally, Ricardo?
It's at São Paulo, from São Paulo.
That's brilliant. You're a brilliant native-like speaker. Congratulations. Brilliant.
Well, thank you. But I have a very long history with English, but I've lived in different places through my life. I've never spent more than 10 years anywhere. The longest I've lived anywhere is was 10 years. So
all right. Okay, so then second of all, when people talk about feeling fear of learning, right? And somebody made on the chat here this remark of with just feel afraid. Do you relate that to a certain psychological aspect, which is self-protective, the ego, right? Because when you're learning something and you have very little dominance or command of the language, you fear misunderstanding, you fear the way people will interpret you, you fear how you're going to pose to these people as a being. And do you find people that after this immersion experience, this is reduced? And you find
Yes.
people who mention this?
Oh, all the time, all the time. So the student who's learning German, I gave her a task. She's an introvert. She's very shy. She loves learning languages, but she mostly does it by reading and listening to music and watching shows and things like that. Usually she does very little, especially oral, spontaneous oral one-on-one interaction. So just chatting with somebody, which is something that we recommend highly, at least a few times a week, as one of the many activities you should do in the self-immersion. And usually, but there's lots of issues. So she did it for the first time this week, and she said she was very anxious and she was very nervous, and it was a man. She's a woman. She said it was a man. He was a little bit older than her, and that increased her anxiety. But she said, but I did it. So I said, well, if you're so anxious and if you're shy and an introvert, probably you should have one partner and stick to that, somebody you feel comfortable with, and stick to that partner for a longer period of time. Now, but the community helps. Yeah, I know. But the community helps. And sharing these experiences helps a lot because we all have some kind of anxiety. As I said, the problem with learning languages is that it touches your identity, it touches your personality, it touches who you are and how you position yourself in the world. And the other thing is when you're learning a language, a new language, I don't like to say foreign languages because the moment you start learning it, it's not foreign anymore. It becomes your language, so it's not foreign.
Embrace.
So I talk about new languages, but when you start learning a new language, you start having to participate in that linguistic community. But then the things you like and the things you do and the way you think of yourself probably doesn't have a perfect match in that linguistic community. So for example, the person that I am here in Brazil, I can't reproduce that in China or in Russia because social categories are different there. So I have to, there are some things that I can use from and that I can just reproduce and adapt quickly when I'm in Russia. But there are some things that I just have to do differently, and I have to be myself in a different way. And so it's challenging. You have to challenge yourself in many different ways and in very intimate ways. So I'll give you an example. I'm gay, which in Brazil is, in other countries where I've lived is a very, commonplace thing. Nobody cares about that anymore. But then I went to Russia, and it's a more repressive society, and I dated, somebody there. And I felt like back in the 1990s because we were in a coffee shop and we were chatting, and he was looking around the whole time, trying to avoid being overheard by other people. And I was like, oh, really? Do I have to go back to that? But you do, because, it's just how it is. And if I'm going to, this summer here in Brazil, I'm going to be going to Egypt, and I'm going to be doing a little bit of Arabic learning there. It's not a crime. It's a crime to publicize homosexual behaviors, deviant moral behaviors, what they call it. But now I'm going to be going to Egypt, and in Egypt, it is illegal. So I'm not going to be dating anyone there. So there are things that you have to do when you go to a different culture that are annoying or offensive, or you have to deal with different things. And one thing that I taught a workshop in Moscow at the university, and I walked into the class and everybody stood up. And then I walked in and I sat down, and then everybody sat down, and I'm like, this is this makes me really uncomfortable. And then the professor who was with me, she said, well, this is just a sign of respect. So the hierarchy between, they always called me Dr. Gualda there. They never called me by my first name. So there are different aspects of life that you just have to adjust to, whether you like them or not. So it is uncomfortable. It's stressful many times. It's sometimes annoying. Sometimes you turn on the TV and it's all crap. You listen to you want to hear a song and it's all horrible. So there are lots of things that you have to adjust to that have to do with how you view yourself, your identity, who you are in the world, your beliefs, your thoughts, your most intimate thing. So it's not easy. I've never told people it was going to be easy. I told them it was, if they could reach it, it would be very effective. But if you want to learn a foreign language and you want to learn it well, you have to learn how to deal with all these things.
I would add the word surrender. You've got to surrender to the new culture, to the new sounds, to the new speed, the new pitch.
I understand what you're saying about. I understand what you're saying about surrendering. It's true. You don't have to try to understand everything and try to make it all very. You don't have to understand every linguistic phenomenon. You don't have to analyze every single thing. Some things just are the way they are. But on the other hand, you have to be very focused and very proactive. So you have to make a conscious effort to engage into those things, because otherwise you'll never get there. You feel frustrated because it gets to a point where you never get there.
Do you follow a syllabus in this immersion course?
Oh yeah, it's what I described in the slide, that we do, like, those different topics that we discuss. And that's how I've structured the book, and that's how the MOOC is going to be, and that's how the future workshops are going to be as well.
Waiting for the MOOC.
I'm starting to write it, but it takes some time. So probably in the middle of next year. So May, June, July, something like that. I'll let you know. Thanks for the interest.
Okay, so I think I'll pass the floor to Jurubola. I think he has a question.
Yeah, I do have a question. Thank you so much for a brilliant speech, Mr. Ricardo. Would you consider such activities like polyglot clubs as artificial functional immersions? And if so, what can you do to make it better for introverts? Thank you.
Yeah, introverts are really, I'm very attentive to the fact that, because I'm always very concerned about introverts, because what happens is that most of the language learning methodologies that we have focus on activities that are very productive for extroverts. So presentations, role play, and things like that, and just speaking out in public and things like that, that are very difficult for introverts. So I think that, especially most of the students in my workshop are introverts. I think they're desperately looking for ways to learn foreign languages. Some of them love it, but they just don't want to do it by talking all the time with strangers. They just don't feel comfortable doing that. So I think that what I try to tell my introvert students is that my introverted students is that you can just develop whatever works for you. That's the point. There's no set way of learning a foreign language, and it should vary through time, and it should vary according to your level and so on. You have to adjust it all the time. So just do whatever feels good for you, good and productive. So whatever it is. In terms of the Grupo Poliglota thing, I always recommend it to everybody. I think that spontaneous one-on-one talk is very important. There's the live version of it that you just, meet with people and talk to them, native speakers or learners as well. I think there's something to gain from both experiences. There's apps like Hello Talk and Speaky and Tandem and so on that do that as well. I've used Speaky extensively with Russian, and it helped me a lot as well. I don't think that it's you as an organizer of the Polyglota community thing who is in charge of doing something for the people who are learning. I think each learner needs to understand that this is something that they really have to engage in. And it's the mindset. It's what I was saying. It's the focus. It's the mindset. And that's something that I can tell you that you need to do that, and it can help you develop that, but it's something that you have to do yourself. So before you understand, and some people want to skip that part of developing their own learning strategy. They want to skip, some parts of this process, but learning how to select your input and how to work that input is the most important thing you're going to do. And learning how to try to control your dominance and all of those things, these are very personal things. And you have to, I can describe them to you and I can try to motivate you to do it, but you have to do it yourself.
Okay, thank you so much, Ricardo. I guess because of, time, we should end here. Okay, thank you for all who, joined us during our first day of Poliglotar 2021.
Let me just leave my email here.
Oh, absolutely. Want to know more about
YouTube channel as well. And whenever I have, the dates for the new workshop, I'll let you know, and you can, send them to anybody who's interested. And when I have the book and the MOOC and so on, I'll let you know. Okay. Thank you for everybody for watching, and have a good night and a good week.
Thank you so much. Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.